It is my personal and professional privilege to introduce our guest scholar this evening, a person that I've known for 18 years, who I consider a colleague, a friend, and a mentor. You may read a detailed biography of Dr. Bobula in her program, but I wanted to extend beyond what's written on the paper, and I would like to describe a few, I would say, my top 3 impressions among many over the years. Number 1. Critical thinking is a fundamental skill in the field of early childhood education and in life. Kathy loves challenging herself and others with the most up-to-date and relevant information. Whether the topic is hand washing, toilet learning, or neuroscience, she models critical thinking, information seeking, and multiple perspective taking. 2. Good teaching is about weaving stories with practical applications. Kathy has the uncanny ability to take complex topics and break them down for real-world use. Spend some time with her and you'll hear many stories of her professional adventures as a frontline worker with the first federal Head Start pilot project in rural Ohio, her experiences as a child care licensor in Arizona, or her teaching escapades with preschoolers in New York City. These stories, combined with her understanding of developmental theory and research, take students and colleagues to new levels of awareness. 3. Knowledge is only as good as it can be put to use. Learning requires taking risks, honesty with ourselves and others, and fundamentally making change. In her scholarly work and in her teaching practice, Kathy is a risk taker. Since the mid-1980s, she's been studying brain development and has challenged students and audiences to think differently about how culture influences development, the differences in male and female brains, the effects of violence and smoking on the developing fetus, and how what we do with children, even the slightest of actions, creates a powerful and lasting imprint in the lives of infants, children, and adults. Her contributions to the field of early education are profound, and her message is a call for change as students, parents, educators, and practitioners. Please join me in welcoming our 2009 Symposium scholar, Dr. Kathy Bobula.
Welcome. I really am very honored to be here for this first symposium. When Andrew talked to me quite a few months ago about doing this, I could hardly believe my ears at what he was saying, and I kept picturing this tiny little group of people, like maybe 40, 50 people or something like that. And then as we got along and got going, I'm, asking him, questions like, well, how many people have signed up, so I want to know how many handouts and stuff. And he started telling me, and I'm going, you're kidding me, it can't be this many people. And I'm really, I must say, I'm just really blown away by how many people showed up, especially on Valentine's Day weekend. But it is a 3-day weekend for some of us, so that was good. But I'm just really excited because when I am very passionate about young children and what happens to families and young children, and so to see this many people come out on a Friday night, and I know that a bunch of you will be here again tomorrow, it's really heartwarming and hopeful to see that, especially as we enter into, in the United States, into a tough time period that we're going to be going through here for a little while with the economy. But let me begin on this. So, good evening to all of you, and to the Portland Community College students and others who may be attending all of the workshops tomorrow. The concepts that we're going to look at tonight will be ones that we will revisit tomorrow in our workshops. So I would like to suggest that if you get some ideas in your head, if you think of something while I'm presenting tonight, jot down any brainstorms that could come into your head for activities, for guidance, for support of children, for working with your environment and the curriculum planning. You may also, as you listen, think about a child with whom you have worked. And if you do, jot down that child's name and any specific thought or image that comes up so you don't forget. And finally, if some thoughts about your own childhood come up, your own development, write those down too, because we'll be revisiting many of these concepts again tomorrow. So to all of you here tonight, students, teachers, parents, and others who are interested in child development, I say tonight that concepts of brain development and brain function must be woven into everything we do with children. Actually, into everything we do, but my focus is on young children tonight. Understanding how the brain works illuminates behavior, theories, and practices, and it shows us in bright lights where our attention must be in terms of supporting young children. Students and scholars of child development are in a prime location, so to speak, for the convergence of brain science and early childhood. We are at the cutting edge of where the research meets practices. Brain science is reinforcing and supporting concepts of development that we already know. And it's providing us with new principles of development and learning on which we can build practices and curriculum. This new perspective on human behavior and learning is especially profound for the field of early childhood education because we work with children in the first years of life, when the brain is still rapidly developing its basic structure or architecture. This lecture will present some key concepts or principles of brain function and brain development and apply them to examples of theories, practices, and educational philosophies from early childhood education. For those who might want to revisit any of the material presented tonight, I will be posting the text of this lecture on my website, and you've got the information on how to find that. So the approach I'm going to take is to answer the question that actually Dr. Forshey posed to me when he invited me to do this, which is, what do we know so far? What have we figured out? And so there are 9 concepts that I plan to explore with you this evening. And so let's start with the first and most basic concept of all. And concept number 1 is that the brain develops itself. When we began to get the soon-to-be revolutionary neuroscience findings in the 1980s, those of us in the fields of early childhood and child development at that time began to learn about the development of the brain itself. We talked about the potential for influencing brain development in children through practices, relationships, and curricula. But when we spoke of brain development, we only had a vague idea of how this was happening. What actually makes the brain develop? Well, what we know is that the brain develops itself. We know that this is directed by genetics, by the DNA that is in the cells of the brain, and we also know that it develops itself based on input from the environment, predominantly after the baby is born. When conception occurs, the original cell starts dividing and replicating itself, creating a ball of cells. In response to a signal at 18 days, the ball of cells forms and creates a neural plate in the location of what will be the midline of the back. And then it folds in on itself, forming the neural tube. At the top of the neural tube, there's a bulb, and this becomes the brain. The tail of the neural tube becomes the spinal cord. The inside of the neural tube will become the ventricles of the brain, the holes in our heads, where there's cerebrospinal fluid. The cells that are next to the cavity of the neural tube will create the cells of the central nervous system. It is this very early stage of brain development that's being addressed through the commercial addition of folic acid to bread products, because a lack of folic acid in the mother's diet is linked to the development of such neural tube defects as spina bifida, which is when the baby is born with the spine exposed. Neurons are the communication cells of the brain, which eventually connect up to each other in dense networks and neural maps throughout the brain. This is a diagram of a neuron, and you'll see that on the left there is what we call the soma, or the cell body, and that's where the DNA is. It's in the nucleus of the cell, and I mean our heads are filled with millions of these. And then coming out from the cell body, you'll see dendrites. And these are receiving projections, or they call them processes of the cell. So this is where information comes in from other neurons. And you'll see that there's little bumps all over the dendrites. And those are, we call those spines. And that increases the surface area of the dendrites so that literally thousands of other neurons can connect up to this one neuron, creating these very dense networks. Then coming off to the right, you'll see the myelin sheath covering the axon. And the axon is the sending process, the sending fiber from the neuron. It's sending the signal down its length. And the myelin sheath is a fatty insulation on the axon. So when some of our axons are very long, some go from like one side of the head to the other, but some of them go like down your spinal cord and out into, your arms and your legs. And to facilitate transmission of the signal along the axon, we need insulation, and there's fat along that. That's what myelin is made out of. And this is why, for infants and toddlers, we prefer that, not only prefer, we insist, that they have full-fat milk in their diet because they're rapidly myelinating the axons in their brain at a record pace at this point, and so they need fat in their diet. Obviously, if a baby is being breastfed, they have ample fat because breast milk is perfect for this. But then even continuing up to age 2, the recommendation is full-fat milk, and then you can drop it down to 2% with preschoolers, but we don't want to do that while this early brain development is happening. So at the end of the axon, you'll see it spreads out into 2 arms, and then each arm has all these fingers coming off of it, and these are projections off the axon with what we call the terminal buttons, and this is where this neuron is going to connect up to others. And so it's the terminal buttons that will then come up to another neuron and cause a chemical signal to go across that gap, which we call the synapse. And that's how we transmit information from one neuron to another. And of course, this happens at like 200 miles an hour. So, I mean, it's really, really fast. And it's all happening. All of our neurons are working most of the time. So after the neurons are created in this new human, some of them will begin a process of actually migrating to get to the location in the brain where they will become the cortex, the outer layer of the brain. These migrating cells have an address and a job. This is one of the ways that the brain grows itself, grows its structure, laid on a pattern that's laid out by the DNA. The cortex, which is the squiggly part that we can see on the outside of the brain, grows itself like an onion in 6 layers from the inside to the outer layers. And actually the neurons that go to the 6th layer have to go through all of those and find their way out to that outer layer to create that. By the time the baby is born, the brain is ready to go, but it will not stay the same, because the baby's brain is designed to adapt. In fact, the brain is the only major body organ that is not done developing when the baby is born. The brain has its basic structure, but it needs to find out what it has to know, what it needs to be good at in the environment into which the baby is born. It is ready to learn. However, this new brain's development is vulnerable to both under and overstimulation. It needs just the right amount of stimulation. An example from the development of the baby's sensory systems will illustrate this by looking at how the brain both creates itself and protects itself. When babies are born, leaving the protecting and nourishing womb, they come out into the world of intense and constant sensation, lights, sounds, smells, textures, touches, tastes. However, human adaptation has favored an immature eye at birth, with an outcome of protecting the newborn brain from being overwhelmed by an onslaught of too much sensory information. Too much bright light can harm the developing brain. A full-term newborn's vision is thought to be fuzzy and like looking through a cardboard tube, dampening down the amount of light allowed to get to the occipital cortex, which is in the back of the brain where vision is processed. As the eye matures, it allows for a gradual increase in visual stimulation to reach the brain, which has already begun its process of adapting its architecture to the specific visual cultural environment in which it is located. In other words, the brain learns how to see through stimulation of the visual sense, through looking. This connects with and provides support for the work of Jean Piaget and his description of the first stage of cognitive development, the sensory motor period, which states that the babies develop their first cognitive schemas through sensory stimulation and action on the environment. Sensory input changes the brain. Now, cultures each have unique ways of seeing the world. So in addition to learning how to see in a technical sense, the baby is also learning what to look at and what it means from his parents and others who interact with him. We'll look at this in more detail when we get to the frontal lobes. For a baby who is born early, before his due date, he comes into the world of sensation with a brain that was promised more time in that muffled and fully supportive environment of the mother's body. Preterm babies who have to be in the intensive care unit of a hospital are having their very immature brains subjected to more than typical stimulation and sensation with all the lights and noisy machines and people of the neonatal intensive care. There's ongoing research that's looking at how this bright and noisy environment might give the immature brain too much stimulation, causing disruption in brain development. Currently, about half of all babies who are born early will have learning problems that will show up when they get into elementary school. Many hospitals have already put procedures into place to reduce the noise and lights of the hospital for preterm babies, thus protecting their brains from overstimulation. In the case of understimulation for the developing brain, babies who have chronic ear infections in the first year of life may run the risk of language and speech delays or disruptions due to the lack of clear hearing during this critical period in brain development when the brain is learning to hear. Likewise, babies born with a cataract must have it removed very early in order for the visual cortex to get the stimulation it requires to ever be able to see out of that eye. The newborn brain requires stimulation to finish developing itself. Not too much, not too little, and at just the right time. There's an interesting fact about the development of vision that makes a good transition into the next part of how the brain develops itself. At birth, although the baby's eye is immature, the baby is able to see objects that are the same distance as the face of their parents and caregivers when they hold the baby in their arms. They're touching each other and looking at each other, ideal for bonding and attachment. Bonding and attachment are critical for another major driver of brain development postnatally. This is the structuring of the brain through the passing on of human culture to the next generation. For this, the brain needs continuous interaction with other people. More precisely, interaction with the content of their brains in the context of a warm and loving relationship. This relationship puts the baby in the best state for learning. When a baby is born, the people who surround the child begin to transfer the cultural information they know, their language, their perceptions, their values to this new human. In this way, the new baby does not have to discover all the accumulated knowledge of our entire history in what would be a hit or miss fashion. Instead, we deliberately expose the baby to the sights, sounds, smells, and people of their world, and the baby's brain modifies its architecture accordingly. For the brain to continue to develop itself, the baby needs to learn what is known to his parents, relatives, and other people. During the first year of life, for example, A hearing infant will strengthen the connections in the hearing centers of the brain that process sounds that are in his culture's language. At the same time, it will discard the brain connections it would have used for other sounds unique to other languages. The baby starts out able to discriminate, to hear the sounds of any of the world's languages. But through interaction with his caregivers, the baby's brain strengthens the connections for the sounds he hears and prunes out connections for the sounds he doesn't hear. DNA lays down a boilerplate structure for the brain that has way too many connections and even too many cells. Once the baby is born, the baby's brain begins to modify and adapt its structure based on the experiences he or she has in the world, especially with other people. This modification happens by strengthening and adding connections between neurons that are used, as well as by pruning away connections that are not being used. In this way, using the case of language as an example, the baby learns what sounds to pay attention to and which ones to ignore, and gradually begins to associate meaning with those sounds. Thus, the brain has been significantly changed by 11 to 12 months. The brain, then, is co-constructed through interactions with other people and within multiple environments, which is consistent with the work of Lev Vygotsky. We modify our brains to learn the language of our family. We even become familiar with and prefer the tastes of our family's diet because we drank our mother's milk, which in turn was flavored by the food she ate. So the environment that we grow up in will determine the specific connections in our brains with all the details and complexities and meanings. The whole process of the brain developing and modifying itself takes about 20 years, from birth to early adulthood. Then the brain stabilizes its structure and makes more minor, though constant, modifications throughout adulthood based on experiences. We never stop learning, and so our brains never stop changing. In fact, it appears that even the aging brain adapts to its own decline. Now, let's go into a little more detail. Concept number 2, use it or lose it. What we do gets transformed into neural circuits in our brains. Neurons are connected to each other at a tiny gap called the synapse, where neurotransmitters are released. It is somewhat of an oxymoron to say that where these cells connect to each other is at a gap or a space, but that's the situation, that's how they talk about it. These neurotransmitters that are released from the end of the neuron's axon will stimulate receptors on the next neuron or neurons, and those will stimulate the next and so on. Each time networks of neurons activate, the connections between the cells become stronger, and the connections increase in number. Likewise, we have the flip-flop. When neural connections go unused, they weaken or let go. Thus, the phrase, use it or lose it. So what does this mean? It means that experience shapes the brain by determining which connections to keep and which connections to prune out. The brain keeps those that are used for better or for worse. And let's take a look at that. On the for better side of use it or lose it, when preschool children build with blocks, for example, they observe the relationships between, say, height and stability. The higher you build, the more issues you have with stability. These observations are stored as patterns of connections between neurons that are based on their observations. They can access this information at a later time when they build with blocks again, or when they observe a skyscraper in construction. They will even be able to bring up a picture of the blocks in their mind. It's like an information bank account. Connections in the brain that are used get kept. This is how knowledge is constructed. When a child is fully engaged in some activity, such as coloring, looking at a book, building a train track, he or she is laying down in the brain patterns and relationships that are observed and experienced. The patterns are more complex and widespread in the brain when the child is fully engaged, more complex than when a child is not engaged for some reason, maybe is distracted by being sick or hungry or sad or bored. Promoting engagement in learning can be done in many ways. One of these ways is to make the content personally relevant to each child. As a young Head Start teacher in 1969, I was always looking for ways to ease the children's transition from circle time to going down the long hall in this elementary school to use the bathroom and wash up for lunch. I'd done the usual things like, who has on red today? But one day, I tried playing with their names. So for Karen, I would ask, whose name sounds like Baron? For Timmy, it was whose name sounds like Simmy. This group of 4-year-olds thought this was so funny. In fact, they really loved this game and they wanted to play it every day. Eventually, they could come up with the sounds like names themselves. Now, in 1969, Head Start had been around long enough, 4 years, that legislators began to ask if this program was worth the cost to the federal government and to the nation's taxpayers. Enter assessment and accountability. We were being asked to measure changes that could lead to later school success. One of the tests given at the end of the year to the children in this Head Start Center was a kindergarten readiness test. When the results came back to the program, the director came down to my room and asked me what the heck I'd been doing, as the children in my classroom had scored off the charts at second grade level in initial sound discrimination. I thought for a minute, and then I realized, of course, it was the Whose Name Sounds Like game. The children loved that game. It was about them. It was their names. And it was so funny to them. You know preschool humor. It's not very funny, but they think it is. Whenever we did this transition activity, they were all intensely focused on the game, trying to be able to figure out whose name it was. When they did, they would yell it out, laughing all the while. It was a pretty noisy transition, but they really learned initial sound discrimination, which is a critical skill for decoding a word phonetically. And reading, literacy, is part of the culture we pass on to each succeeding generation. Since what we do gets wired into the circuits of our brains, even the very act of being engaged lays down a pattern. So the child becomes engaged again and again with greater ease. Becoming engaged becomes automatic. It's up to teacher caregivers of young children to ensure that children are safe in the setting, both physically and psychologically. Every teacher caregiver must actively create a warm and supportive relationship with each child in her or his care. In the context of the attachment that forms and the safety that brings, the child can become engaged again and again. Now let's look at an example from the for worse side of the use it or lose it principle. If a child, for example, is the victim of bias, be it ethnic or racial bias, gender bias, ability bias, or so on, this child will have to spend a lot of time and energy trying to cope with the people who are expressing that bias. Some children who are victimized may become hypervigilant to other people's reactions or behavior for the sake of self-protection. Because this is what the child is doing, this exaggerated stress response can lay down patterns in the brain so that it becomes automatic. Since hypervigilance usually comes with elevated and sometimes chronic anxiety, it takes a toll on both the child's learning and their health. What we do will come to be wired into the neural circuits of the brain, for better or for worse. The hours spent playing video games or watching television grab a lot of cortical space and strengthen our ability and preference to learn in these ways at the expense of space that could be used for, say, reading or listening. Learning from a book or a lecture becomes hard. In the world of the cortex, there is a constant competition for real estate, for connection. Use it or lose it. This concept goes hand in hand with the next. Concept number 3, repetition forms stronger and more elaborate memories. Simply put, the more we do something, the more numerous are the connections between neurons, and the stronger the connections are neurologically. This is especially true if we repeat activities on multiple occasions, on different days, or over time. We get better at it, understand it more, and can apply it. Remember the old saying, practice makes perfect? Well, we may not be aiming for perfection, but practice does yield ability and expertise. Take concepts of number, for example. In one study, researchers found that early childhood teachers who use numbers in their everyday speech may aid in their students' math abilities. For example, in getting ready to go outside, a teacher could say, "You two get your coats on, please," instead of saying, "You guys get your coats on, please." Hearing number references throughout the day within the context of daily activities helps the child build more elaborate concepts of number and number relationships. Some teachers limit the number of children allowed to play in each of the activity centers, and they put up a sign with the number of children allowed expressed as both a number and as that many stick figures. This brings up the use of number as well as addition and subtraction in a real way for children on a daily basis. This prompts them to learn how to count accurately so they can figure out if they can go into the area. As children work with open-ended materials over and over again like blocks and paints and clay, they construct a richer understanding of the uses of the materials, which in turn provides scaffolding for doing more with the material. As a child learns more about something, the new knowledge supports the child to think about it at higher and higher cognitive levels and to apply what they learn to other situations. This is another example of how brain science findings give support to the theoretical concepts of Lev Vygotsky. I remember the first time I had real artist's clay to use with preschoolers. I became committed to having it out as often as I would have put out Play-Doh. For quite a while, the children simply explored the new qualities, which are not at all like Play-Doh. I kept putting it out. Then one day, and this was in a parent co-op preschool, I had two fathers as assistants, both of whom gravitated to the clay. Within 20 minutes, there were about 8 children at the clay table, which was becoming covered with a sort of jungle forest thing with an interesting variety of animals. All the while, they talked about what they were making and why. The children and adults stayed at this activity for over an hour. The children needed to work with the clay over and over again until they developed a sufficient knowledge of the material, and then they could take it to a much higher level and express what they had in their minds. They got ideas from each other and from the adults, which provided scaffolding, in Vygotsky's words, to support more mature thinking as well as more mature behavior. And emotionally, they had a great time. Lillian Katz wrote an article a number of years ago about the difference between education and excitement in early childhood classrooms. She admonished us not to fall into the trap of having something new every day. Whenever children come across novelty, something new, they have to spend a lot of time, as well as brain space and power, in exploring the new material or activity. There's nothing wrong with that, but it can be overdone. The processes and knowledge required don't have enough time to become routine or automatic, which is the point at which we can use the skills and materials to express our ideas and solve problems. For example, once a child becomes familiar with scissors, paper, and glue, then the child can create something with those materials. The child may even think about what they want to make at school the next day, if they know what the possibilities are with the materials at hand. Familiarity with materials provides scaffolding for creation and learning. Elkonin Goldberg, in his book on the frontal lobes, states that unlike instinctive behavior, learning, by definition, is change. At an early stage of every learning process, the organism is faced with novelty. And at the end stage of the learning process, this can be thought of as routinization or familiarity. The transition from novelty to routinization is the universal cycle of our inner world. In fact, novelty is processed more strongly in the right hemisphere, and cognitive routines are processed more strongly in the left hemisphere, though it may be the opposite for left-handers. According to Goldberg, as the neural activation moves its concentration from the right hemisphere to the left, there is an overall decrease of prefrontal activation. This means that skills have become automatic or routine, and those that have become automatic don't take up as much cortical space or energy as do novel experiences. Automatic skills and knowledge can be combined in new ways, which usually takes the child to a more mature way of thinking or behaving. So having paper, crayons, scissors, glue, tape, and all those things available for children every day allows them to advance their thinking and problem solving when using these familiar materials, rather than having to start at the beginning and explore the essential nature of novel or new materials. Repetition forms stronger and more elaborate memories. Let's take a look at the next concept. Concept number 4, cells that fire together, wire together. Experiences that occur together in space and time are connected in the brain literally. This young girl in the picture is constructing information about grocery shopping and about her relationship with her father. She's learning problem solving, such as comparison shopping, and she's associating positive emotions, shopping with her father, with all of this. Her father may even be modeling self-regulation by inhibiting his desire to pick up anything that looks good, especially if he's hungry. Associations can be remarkably strong and long-lasting. All thoughts have associated emotions connected to them. All experiences have emotions connected to them. If one of our goals is to help children develop a love of learning, we need to make sure that the learning environment is positive, supportive, individualized, and embedded in relationships, warm relationships. In addition, the materials and activities must also be developmentally appropriate. Bruce Perry says that if a child is asked to do something or learn something that is beyond his grasp, the pleasure of learning diminishes. If a child fails repeatedly, he will be less willing to take on new challenges, even if these new challenges are well within his grasp. Guidance of children must have learning as its goal. Teacher caregivers should employ positive guidance techniques and explain the why of a rule or guideline. Cells that fire together, wire together. If consequences are imposed in response to an unacceptable behavior, they must be logically related to the misbehavior and consistently applied if we want children to remember them. For example, repeatedly crashing a bike into the wall leads to loss of bike use for the day. Children learn rules and guidelines through repetition. Thus, predictable daily schedules allow children to respond to transitions between activities with more self-regulation and less chaos. Concept number 5. Plasticity of the brain's connections and functions is where adaptation occurs. The brain changes its structure minute by minute in multitude of ways, adapting itself to a changing environment. Right now, your own brain has changed from what it was when you walked in here. The changes in the brain that occur during the first 20 years of life are creating basic architecture as well as encoding memories and constructing knowledge based on experiences. During all of adulthood, the brain continues to construct itself and solves problems, big and small. As we solve problems and attempt to achieve goals, we learn from the results and use this information the next time. Each time we revisit a problem to solve or a goal to achieve, we reconstruct our knowledge about it. We adapt. Describing the brain as dynamic is an understatement. It modifies itself every minute of every day in multiple ways at once. What do neuroscientists mean by plastic when they talk about the brain? Take a second to think about all the forms that plastic can take. Grocery bags, children's toys, telephones, medical equipment, shrink wrap, and sippy cups, to name a few. The thing about plastic is that it can take many forms, depending upon what we do to it. If we process the plastic one way, it is very hard with a rigid shape. Process it another way, and it is soft and formless. Well, the brain too is plastic. It changes its shape, so to speak, depending on the experiences it has, just like plastic materials. So the concept that the brain is plastic tells us that experiences that we have determine the structure of the brain in terms of connections between neurons, which in turn will impact all later thoughts, feelings, growth, and behavior throughout the entire life. So in this sense, too, we are what we do, especially in the early years. Plasticity of the brain also means that when there is damage to an area of the brain can reorganize, particularly in childhood. Since the brain is developing very rapidly in the first 5 years, early intervention services for children with disabilities can have a huge impact on changing that plastic brain in a way that will help the child overcome their disability or adapt to it more successfully. A basic concept of early intervention is the sooner the better, and that is supported by neuroscience. The developments in the brain that happen early in life are producing structures upon which all other development and function will depend. Early brain development provides the base for all later development. During the period from birth to young adulthood, the brain is especially plastic because it is still creating its basic structure. And the younger the child, the more plastic the brain is. So the activities that the developing person does most, spends the most time at, what we call sustained activities, will have a big impact on the brain, especially if they start to do these activities in the early years. For example, children who learn to play a musical instrument fairly early in childhood, typically between 3 and 8 years of age, will create more connections between the neurons, larger brain maps in the places in the brain that are involved in playing that instrument. These can be brain maps for behaviors such as movement and sound perception. Studies of young children who learn to play the violin starting at ages 3 and 4 show larger brain areas devoted to the fingers of the left hand which push down the strings to make the correct note. The impact on the brain of activities that we do is not limited to things like learning to play the violin. Norman Doidge gives the following examples, and he says, and I quote, "Brain scans of London taxi drivers show that the more years a cabbie spends navigating London streets, the larger the volume of his hippocampus, that part of the brain that stores spatial representations. Even leisure activities change our brain. People who meditate and teach meditation have a thicker insula, a part of the cortex activated by paying close attention." In spite of the impressive flexibility of the brain, plasticity has its limits. We can see this in people who have suffered a stroke. In spite of intensive physical or speech therapy, they may not be able to recover all of their prior abilities. Additionally, neuroscientists have found that brain plasticity declines with age. According to Norman Doidge, exposure to television between the ages of 1 and 3 correlates with problems paying attention and controlling impulses later in childhood. This is more of an issue with younger children. With toddlers, as the number of hours they watch television increases, so do their chances of developing serious attentional difficulties at age 7. In fact, in this study, for every hour of TV watched by a toddler, their chances for developing a problem with attention increased by 10%. How we get our information, by reading, watching, or listening, determines how our brain processes it. One study showed that different brain areas are involved in hearing speech and reading it, and different comprehension centers are involved in hearing words and reading them. Different modes of learning leave different sets of memories. Each medium leads to a change in the balance of our individual senses, increasing some at the expense of others. And this brings us to concept number 6. The frontal lobes of the brain take the longest to develop, and they require a lot of practice to mature. The frontal lobes are the forwardmost part of the brain and are especially large in humans. The frontal lobes, occipital lobes, temporal lobes, and parietal lobes make up the majority of the brain's cortex. The cortex is that outer layer in the brain that has deep folds and looks like a cauliflower. The cortex is divided into 2 hemispheres, a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. The frontal lobes are the thinking part of the brain that allows us to move, think, and talk, among many other things. The frontal lobes of the cortex are of particular interest to those of us in child development and early childhood education. Elkonin Goldberg, in his book on the frontal lobes of the brain, introduced this area of the brain in the following way. He said, "Frontal lobes perform the most advanced and complex functions in all of the brain, the so-called executive functions. They are linked to intentionality, purposefulness, and complex decision-making. They reach significant development only in humans. Arguably, they make us human. The frontal lobe of the cortex includes areas that are responsible for the initiation of motor movement, as well as these higher order executive functions, which play critical roles, as well as these higher order executive functions. Bruce Wexler states that the late maturing frontal lobe regions play critical roles in language function in general and word generation in particular. In fact, it appears, but is not conclusive, that the development of the frontal lobe functions is dependent on sensory stimulation. These executive control functions, did that too quick. These executive frontal lobe functions also include voluntary attention. We spend a lot of time teaching children what to pay attention to. It includes memory, organization, planning, and strategy selection. Self-awareness and awareness of others are some of the social functions of the frontal lobes. Since frontal lobes take so long to mature beyond puberty, it is not surprising that adults must provide these functions, these executive functions, if they are to be present in the behavior of infants and children. While the child's frontal lobes are developing, the parents' brains provide frontal lobe functions for the child. For children in full and part-day programs, the teaching caregiving staff provide the frontal lobe functions for the children. For example, if a child wants to play at riding the bus or public transit, she may not know how to get this to happen. The adult, be they parent or teacher caregiver, can guide the child by asking some questions that will aid in planning. The questions will direct the child's attention to what materials are needed and how to get them, as well as who is on the bus and what do they each do. The adult could ask the child, what's the first thing that happens when you get on the bus? What does the bus look like on the inside? How does the driver know you want to get off? Can animals ride the bus? If so, what kind of animals? The forwardmost area of the frontal lobes is referred to as the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is located behind the forehead and is directly interconnected through long axons with every other area of the brain, with all functional units. It is singularly suited for coordinating and integrating the work of other brain structures. It brings vision, hearing, language, emotion, meaning, etc. all together. It takes all the parts and coordinates them into a coherent idea. The prefrontal cortex is the conductor of the orchestra, and as such, contains a map of the whole cortex. Damage to the prefrontal cortex due to head trauma can profoundly disrupt these conductor functions and thus thinking. Self-regulation is a frontal lobe function, and one particular aspect of self-regulation is predictive of all academic outcomes, especially early math ability. It is termed the inhibitory aspect of brain function, and it is used in planning, problem solving, and goal-directed activity. It helps us stay focused on the task at hand and to inhibit being distracted by outside influences or other internal thoughts or urges. Self-regulation must be learned by doing over and over again, and in many different situations throughout development. Remember that repetition strengthens existing connections and creates new ones. Self-regulation involves the prefrontal cortex, as this area plays the central role in forming goals and objectives and then in devising plans of action to attain these goals. The prefrontal cortex selects the cognitive skills required to implement the plans, like asking, what do I know that applies to this? It coordinates these skills and applies them in a correct order. Finally, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for evaluating our actions as success or failure relative to our intentions. The Tools of the Mind curriculum by Elena Bedrova and Deborah Leon, which is based in the work of Vygotsky, helps teachers support goal-directed behavior in children by arming them with mental strategies, or what they call tools of the mind. This is a book I highly recommend to teacher caregivers of young children. Concept number 7. This is one of my favorites. Mirror neuron networks exist. Among other things, they allow us to feel others' emotions and know their intentions. Mirror neurons. These special cells in the brain that were discovered by Giacomo Rizzolatti and colleagues in an Italian lab in 1991 promise to provide us with an awareness of what it means to be human that is unprecedented in the history of psychology. V.S. Ramachandran, a noted neuroscientist, stated in 2001 that, and I quote, "Without a doubt, it is one of the most important discoveries ever made about the brain. Mirror neurons will do for psychology what DNA did for biology. They will provide a unifying framework and help explain a host of mental abilities that have hitherto remained mysterious and inaccessible to experiments." To understand mirror neurons, we need to step back a bit and first look at the concept of body maps in the brain, as described so well by Sandra Blakesley, a well-known science writer, and Matthew Blakesley, also a science writer, and I discovered he's her son, in their book called "The Body Has a Mind of Its Own." New information about the brain indicates that our brain constructs maps. The Blakesleys point out that the brain has a complete map of your body's surface, with patches devoted to each finger, hand, cheek, lip, eyebrow, shoulder, hip, knee, and all the rest. Now, this we have known for quite a while. What is new to Western psychology is that you have maps for aspects of the world outside of your body. There's a bubble of space around a person's body that his brain includes as part of him. And in its map of his, and it includes that part of him in its map of his body. It extends outward to just beyond your fingertips when you stretch out your arms. Your brain contains a map of this space. Sometimes the space may include your good friend. And if you use a tool, say a rake or a pencil, this map extends to that tool as well. There are touch maps, motor maps, and visceral maps of your internal organs. In fact, according to the Blakesleys, research now shows that your brain is teeming with body maps. Maps of your body's surface, its musculature, its intentions, its potential for action, even a map that automatically tracks and emulates or copies the actions and intentions of other people around you. Here, I ask you to recall one of the earlier concepts, that of plasticity. It applies to body maps in that they are profoundly plastic and can reorganize and change their configurations and what they include based on experiences, damage to the brain, or practice. Learning to cut with scissors involves creating or modifying our motor maps. The more children cut with scissors and the more different materials they cut with scissors, the more complex their maps will be. According to the Blakesleys, we create these maps in early development. And as we grow and mature, so do these body-centered maps. In adulthood, they continue to change, but not as fast as they do in childhood. The body maps we create in childhood will be with us for the rest of our lives. This information alone should give us pause in thinking about the critical importance of active learning, play-based curriculum for early childhood education. If one of the brain tasks of the early years is to create these body maps, then it is of utmost importance that children are moving all day in hands-on, sensory-based activities, hopefully with one or more other children and adults. This is not a new concept. Neuroscience is simply reinforcing and supporting some of the most basic principles of child development and early learning. There is now a known neurological basis for why this hands-on, active approach has worked so well for child learning and socialization. Now let's look more specifically to mirror neurons. Mirror neurons, according to the Blakesleys, comprise a previously unrecognized element of certain body maps. They are a special set of cells within certain high-level body maps that represent actions performed both by oneself and by others. Hence, they are the key to many higher mental functions, including imitation, empathy, and the ability to read another's intentions. The primary role of human mirror neurons is to understand the meaning of the actions of others. Mirror neurons are found in multiple areas of the cortex of the brain. Body maps with mirror neurons are in your premotor cortex, and these are the ones that are active when you are either doing or perceiving an action, with action being defined as intentional and purposeful behaviors. There is another body map with mirror neurons in the superior temporal sulcus, which tracks body movements happening outside of oneself. It tracks movements such as walking and arm swinging, which would be a survival skill, as in, is that a predator in the bushes? This body map, one of the main inputs to your mirror neuron circuits, is part of the visual system that is exquisitely tuned to biological motion, a sort of life detector. Sandra Blakesley and Matthew Blakesley state that mirror neuron networks or circuits can be thought of as body maps that run simulations of what other people's body maps are up to. They allow you to grasp the minds of others, not through conceptual reasoning, but by modeling their actions, intentions, and emotions in the matrix of your own integrated network of body maps. When someone sweeps with a broom, you automatically simulate or copy the sweeping action in your own brain. The actions that cause the strongest mirror neuron responses are those actions we know the best. Thus, early childhood programs help prepare children for elementary school by exposing them to teacher behaviors and school behaviors. As the children get familiar with these behaviors, they will be easier to understand in the first grade. Priming mirror neurons for school helps level the playing field for all children. Mirror neurons allow a child to understand the meaning of other people's actions by processing them directly within the child's own body maps. This also applies to emotions that we see other people expressing. Thus, the mirror neuron networks let us read each other's minds, so to speak. The Blakesleys quote Giacomo Rizzolatti saying that, quote, "We are exquisitely social creatures. Our survival depends on understanding the actions, intentions, and emotions of others. We simulate these automatically, without logic, without thinking, without analyzing. Mirror neurons provide internal simulation of what we are observing in others, thus activating the very same cells in our brains that we use to do the behavior. Noticing the difference in what it feels like to actually do something and how it feels to watch someone else do the same thing is how the infant begins to develop a sense of self in contrast to other people. Babies are born with a motor mirror neuron system already in place. Whoops, I went backwards, sorry. Babies are born with a mirror neuron system already in place that allows imitation within moments of their birth. By age 2, children are primarily learning through imitation, which lets them absorb far more knowledge and skill than could ever be possibly explained to them verbally. Their mirror neurons allow them to learn through simply seeing, hearing, and touching. This is more evidence in support of a hands-on, play-based curriculum and in the use of American Sign Language with babies and toddlers. In fact, young children's brains are very good at picking up behaviors from others via imitation. What preschool teacher doesn't know that? But they are also able to pick up on the goal of other people's behavior. Marco Iacoboni thinks that one of the primary goals of imitation may actually be the facilitation of an embodied intimacy between the self and others during social relations. Mirror neuron networks allow us to really know other people. We know people's intentions as well as the content of their behavior. We can detect fakes. We can feel another's pain. Emotions are contagious. We actually feel what the other person is feeling. This is why your stomach jumps when you see a child trip and fall. We literally catch what the other person is feeling. Thus, the quality of our relationships with other people has an impact on how we feel and function. According to Daniel Goleman, nourishing relationships have a beneficial impact on our health, while toxic ones can act like slow poison in our bodies. Toxic relationships, especially in a workplace, cannot be ignored. Mirror neurons operate largely outside of consciousness, so we are not aware that they are working. This means that if a child is exposed to adults who hold a bias of any variety, racial, ethnic bias, gender bias, etc., the child will absorb the attitudes and assumptions without being aware of it. These types of unconscious attitudes are what psychologists call implicit bias. Implicit bias does influence our behavior, and children do read it on us and mirror it, feel it, and incorporate it into their knowledge about the world. Racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, all the biases are contagious. On the other hand, tolerance, acceptance, active anti-biasism are also contagious. If we work to find out the stereotypes we hold of certain characteristics of people and then work to learn the opposite attitude, children will see this. They will copy this. They will internalize this. Mirror neurons give us the neuroscience explanation for Albert Bandura's social learning theory and the impact of role models on children's behavior and thoughts. Children learn more from us than we ever realize. Thus, it is critical that teachers of young children actively work on discovering and actively reducing biases that they hold about other people. To avoid this work is unethical, because the very first principle of our code of ethics says, do no harm. Bias harms both children and adults. To ignore this is critical. To ignore this critical personal work is harmful. I feel very strongly about this, and I feel we cannot put this off till later. So, I'm going to give you some homework. I invite you all to go to the following website, and it is on the handout I gave you. I've listed it there. It's called Project Implicit. It's at Harvard University. And I invite you to take some of the implicit bias tests that are there. You do them right on your personal computer, and you will receive information and an interpretation of the results for your tests. This can give you somewhere to start. Awareness is critical, but you cannot stop there. Therefore, I'm going to teach you a technique for countering biased attitudes that you discover that you have. In an article entitled Buried Prejudice, Siri Carpenter cites the following unpublished study that was done by B. Keith Payne and Brandon D. Stewart. This study addressed the question of how you can gain control over automatic processes that underlie implicit biases. Payne and Stewart used a commonly held implicit bias in the United States, which is a fear of African Americans, especially African American men. The authors found that those people in their study who simply resolved to think of the word safe whenever they saw a black face showed dramatic reductions in implicit bias, in implicit racial bias. You don't necessarily have to beat people over the head with it, Payne observes. You can just have this little plan in your pocket. Think safe, that you can pull out when you need it. Once you've gone to the work of making that specific plan, it becomes automatic. The bias got into our heads through associations, so it makes sense we can disrupt them through purposely making different associations, ones that contradict the stereotypes. A friend of mine who has mobility limitations and uses a motorized wheelchair told me that many people hold a bias that people in wheelchairs are not smart. For this bias, using Payne and Stewart's approach, we could fight it by thinking intelligent whenever we see a person in a wheelchair. Concept number 8. The brain is a social brain. We are wired to connect, says Daniel Goleman. Our brains are set up to make relationships with other people. We are learning that the interaction between parent and baby is critical for the setting up and activation of the mirror neuron networks, which are necessary for effective social interaction and the development of empathy. Marco Iacoboni points out that imitation and mirror neurons allow us to develop a sense of intimacy between ourselves and others, which is a building block of social cognition. The study of early human development also shows how imitation is powerfully linked to the development of important social skills. For instance, the understanding that other people have their own thoughts, beliefs, and desires. In cognitive psychology, this is referred to as a child's theory of mind or metacognition. Our brains require social contact from the moment of birth. For example, parents aid their baby in learning how to return to a state of equilibrium after getting upset. They do this by quieting the baby through such techniques as rocking, cooing, touching, talking, or singing in a soothing voice. The parents figure out what works, and then they keep using this approach. Duh. The baby comes to expect this approach and is quieted more quickly when it is held and soothed by its mother than when it is held and soothed by another woman, even if the second woman has had as much or more experience caring for infants as the infant's own mother. The baby's brain develops connections around this quieting, and these connections will eventually support the baby's ability to return to that state on their own when they are upset. This knowledge reminds us of the importance of continuity of caregiving for infants and toddlers. They need consistent, meaning the same, caregivers throughout the day and over time. This is one of the significant strengths that the family child care model can offer, as well as continuous care models in centers, where the teacher starts with the youngest age group and moves with them as they grow. High staff turnover found in full day care programs subjects these youngest of children to a very stressful and confusing environment, not at all conducive for attachment, predictability, or learning. Children thrive in long-term, supportive, reciprocal relationships with people who form a bond with them. This is what the brain is expecting, which leads to the 9th and final concept. Concept number 9. We are designed to make culture. Culture is the way humans adapt to the changing environment. The baby's brain adapts to match the brains of the people who care for and interact with the baby. The baby attunes herself to her caregivers so she begins to see the world as they do. She pays attention to what they pay attention to, moves her body in rhythm to their speech patterns, and makes maps of these. Babies learn the gestures of their parents and caregivers, as well as the meanings of these gestures. And babies come to expect to see them. According to V.S. Ramachandran, discovering and studying mirror neuron networks gives us an alternative explanation for brain development in humans. He says, quote, "Your brain is not unique because it has evolved highly specialized modules, but because it is parasitic or symbiotic with culture. Mirror neurons absorb culture the way a sponge soaks up water. You learn much more easily how to shoot an arrow or skin a bear by watching your mom and dad do it than by listening to them describe it. Mirror neurons set the stage for the horizontal transmission of culture from parent to child, from person to person. Reading and math and language and customs are passed on in this way. Our brains adapt themselves to the particular details of the unique culture that envelops us. Culture is not the icing on the cake. Culture is the cake. We make culture, and then the culture in turn changes our brains. Our changed brains then modify the culture further. It's what we do. In conclusion, I'd like to summarize and emphasize a couple of the most important concepts and their applications. First, each child has a unique brain which is ready to adapt and learn. For the youngest children, we must try as hard as we can to adapt the program, the people, and the curriculum to the child, rather than the other way around. As children enter the 3 to 5 years, we can begin to introduce them to different environments, routines, and guidelines. We must support the child in learning how to adapt to the group, to the school culture. As we do this, we must remember that with every thought and every behavior, there is an emotion attached or associated with it. Be ever aware of your frontal lobe role for children. Teach children strategies for planning, setting goals, and achieving them. Remember that this responsibility for supporting frontal lobe executive functions continues into early adulthood. We can't give up when they turn 16. And finally, keep in mind that people of all ages can read your mind with their mirror neurons. All your feelings and biases and preferences are public, and they cannot be hidden. And as such, these biases and preferences can impact others. The only solution is to recognize what those biases and preferences are and work on changing the ones that are negative, or stereotypes, and detrimental to other people, both young and old. I want to thank all of the people who pulled this together tonight, and for all of you who came here, and I'm looking forward to seeing many of you tomorrow at the workshops where we go into a little more detail on some of these concepts. And so now I will invite anyone, if you've got some questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Yes?
How does excessive video gaming interrupt brain development, did you say?
Yeah, excessive both television watching and playing video games, what it does is that as the brain is developing, whatever we spend our most time doing, that's what the brain will actually make connections and make us better at. That's why when we see young people who've been playing a lot of video games or text message a lot, they're really good at it. They go very, very fast. They're very facile at it. The issue with that, beyond, whether there's violent content or things like that, the issue is that if a child spends a lot of time when they are developing the architecture of their brain, getting information, spending time watching television and playing video games, their brain will specialize in watching television and playing video games, which could be fun for a while, but I don't think this is going to get you a job in the future. And it really, what it does is it grabs cortical space. The brain's, whatever we do grabs the connections. So if I'm spending all my time watching television, I'm going to start transforming my brain so more connections are available for me to focus on watching TV and learning from watching TV. And the same is true with video games. So what we're looking at really is a balancing act. What do we want? What are the skills we want children to have as they grow up? Whatever those are, that's what they should be doing in childhood, at the childhood way. I mean, we're not going to teach them calculus when they're 2. But if they spend their time playing video games, and there are people who spend 4 or 5 hours a day playing games like that, they're becoming good at being video game players. Now, maybe they might do good on a flight simulator or something. I'm not sure. I suppose there's some job category out there that might favor someone who's good at playing video games, but I don't know of many. And the other thing is that for a long time, of course, we've always worried about children who spend too much time watching television. We're more concerned with what are they not doing when they're watching television. They're not playing, they're not looking at a book, they're not thinking, they're not making stuff, they're not practicing things. So I think we see it as time wasted. I will say that there has been research that showed that kids that do a lot of video games they speed up their reflexes in their hands. So, I mean, if that's something and they'll probably be very good on a computer, typing very fast. But again, is that the most important skill we want to develop? So that's really more of the issue. Now, with television, though, for very young children, because, I mean, a toddler's not going to play a video game, but I do know of people that set a toddler in front of a television. That actually does disrupt the development of the brain and has been found to be highly correlated with attention difficulties once they get into elementary school. Child can seem just fine all the time before they go to school. They hit first grade and they hit a brick wall. And now they're having trouble paying attention, staying focused on the activity, and particularly are having trouble listening to the teacher because they haven't been practicing listening, they've been practicing playing a game. So we want them to do we want them to practice what we want them to keep. That's what we want. In dentistry, our dentist one time sent us a card, reminding us of an appointment, and it had a cartoon on it with a mother helping her kid brush his teeth, and he's asked, do I really have to brush all my teeth? And she said, no, you don't have to brush them all. You don't have to floss all your teeth. Only floss the ones you want to keep. Well, that's the same way with the brain. Floss the part of the brain you want to keep. What part are you willing to give up? And I'm not willing to give up any. And I'm not willing to take away any child's cortical space and devote it to a video game when they could be looking at a book or simply looking at the sky and contemplating clouds. I think that's time better spent. I think they do a little introspection and thinking, and they're also not moving. And just think about that. They're controlling their movement. And we always appreciate that in preschoolers.
How about music? You talked a little bit about the violin.
Yeah.
Singing, just listening to music. What kind of effect does that have on the brain?
Music activities in early childhood are one of the great ways to create in the brain the ability to self-regulate, especially to inhibit our behavior. And that's one of the things we're going to look at in the morning workshop tomorrow. But when we do movement activities and music where you have to stay on the beat, obviously, or it's real apparent you aren't on the beat, what we're learning to do is, like, say, when we clap to something. So if we're clapping to a song, I have to learn when to clap, don't clap, clap, don't clap, clap, don't clap, tap. I got to learn when to clap and when not to. Because if I'm just clapping, well, everybody turns around and says, you messed it up. So we get that feedback. So we try and all clap together. We all march together. We sing together. And what I'm learning to do is I'm learning to control my voice, my mouth, control my movement, and also try to match my movement to what you're doing, what everybody else is doing. Now, that's multitasking at a preschool level. That's learning, to walk to school and carry your lunch, as they used to say, or chew gum and think at the same time. When we are doing music activities, whether we're marching, playing instruments, singing songs, reciting poetry, any of those activities, we are developing a child's mental control over their emotions, over their behavioral movements, but mostly they're able to inhibit their behavior to fit into that activity. And so the more we spend time doing music activities with children, and I know that for a lot of early childhood people, it's your least favorite activity, especially to do in front of other adults. But what you need to remember is that most preschool teachers can't sing worth anything, and that we only sing a couple tunes as it is, Marietta Little Lamb, that kind of stuff. I make up songs, and I just use, Twinkle Twinkle as the tune for all of them. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. Children don't care. But so if you can't sing, don't worry about it. You're singing to preschoolers. They're very forgiving. And so, we don't have to worry. We're worried about the adults thinking that we're, oh boy, she really can't sing at all. But we need to sing, and we need to glory in our singing. We need to enjoy it and sing loud and enjoy each other, because one of the things we know about singing together, and I'm really glad you asked this question, is that, and this is why a lot of people like to be in choruses or sing in different, settings with other people. When we sing together and we're all like saying the same words, our brains are literally matching up with each other. So when people say when they sing in a group that they come out feeling like fantastic, they feel refreshed, they just feel wonderful, happy, it's because we have made the most intimate connection we can make with other people, which is my brain to your brain, my brain to your brain, where all our brains are lined up and they're doing the same thing at the same time. And it is a powerful experience because it connects us to other people. This is why whenever we do things with other people, we like them better. People you don't know and you don't like, once you get to know them, you start liking them. Because we start to tune ourselves to each other. Our mirror neurons go off. I know what you're feeling, you know what I'm feeling. Not only do we know what each other's feeling, I know what you're intending. This is why, especially when people have been together for a long time, we finish each other's sentences. I mean, we do that all the time, especially in a relationship. It's pathetic, but we do it. You say the first two words, I finish your sentence, because I know what you're going to say. But that's because our mirror neurons are really tuned up to each other. And so I highly recommend doing music activities and make up your own songs. That's a workshop that I periodically do, is one where I get teachers in to a workshop and then I make them write songs. And we use a whole stock list of, songs. So you can use Twinkle, Twinkle, Bear Went Over the Mountain, all those tunes, whatever works with the words you want. And then you just make up your own song. In one workshop I gave, I had a woman, this one just blew me away. She wrote a song about who brought you to school today, and it kind of, who brought you to school today, school today, school today, and that kind of a thing. And then the second verse is, who's going to pick you up today, up today, up today? Because she said that in her program, there were children whose families were divorced. And like on Monday, whoever had the child on the weekend brought the child in, but the other parent who had them during the week picked them up. And she saw children stressing about this. Who's picking me up? Where am I going today? And so in this workshop, she wrote this song, and it is on my website, because whenever I do workshops and people come up with curriculum ideas, and this I'll be asking you to do tomorrow, I like to have people share them so I can get them out there so that we share them with everyone. And it really touched me that she thought about that little moment for a child of just that little worry, who's picking me up today? And so she came up with a song that they could sing, and it'd be a good Monday morning song. Because it's Monday when that happens, and probably Friday is the other day that it happens on, because that's usually the way people make arrangements. So become songwriters. And you could even publish your own book or something if you get really good at it.
Okay. Amy, do you have another taker over there?
Okay, and save your questions too. Dr. Bobula will be with us tomorrow,
Yes.
and you'll have a lot of time with her. So save your questions. If you want to put them on the table, we can gather them up.
Yeah.
As well. So I have two. I've been asked to speak. How does the brain develop? You touched on this. When a child learns more than one language, what were?
Ooh, that's a good one. And that is so cool. Makes you want to have every kid be bilingual because it's so wonderful what happens. What happens is whenever a child is raised bilingually, there's usually one language that is slightly more dominant than another one, that they hear a little bit more often. And so we refer to them as a child's first and second language. So the child's first language, when the child is learning that, when we learn language as little babies, we're using both hemispheres of the brain, but as we get good at the language, it goes from the right to focusing in the left hemisphere, and that's where the speech centers are. Broca's area is a big speech center in the brain. So with your first language that you know best, it fairly quickly, at somewhere like about 12 to 14 months, if this baby is starting from birth being bilingual, that first language concentrates in the left hemisphere. It becomes highly routinized. It's just second nature to the child. The second language that they learn comes into both hemispheres. It tends to stay in both hemispheres. And that's why it is not quite as strong or as like that to the child. But we know that the outcome for the child's cognitive abilities, the ability to solve problems, gets bigger, it's broader, it's more expansive. Each language has in it a way of looking at the world. It's got phrases in it that explain things that you can't learn, that they don't have words for in another language. And whenever you study a language, you find these things out. And actually, many of us adopt certain words from other languages that are better words than what we have in English. And so we just say those words because they work better. So when children have more than one language system, more than one grammar system, more than one perspective on a problem, we find that they think in a more cognitively complex way. They are better problem solvers. They are more open to different kind of thinking out of the box. The list is long on what the benefits are for bilingualism. If we could do it, we should be raising every child with two languages if we could. And if you're thinking about it, if you're about to have a baby and you want to do this, I have worked with many parents who did raise their children to be bilingual. And there was one family that really struck me that they just had it nailed down so good. And this was when I was teaching in New York City. And I was in a parent co-op preschool near Columbia University. So we had a lot of parents in this preschool who were students at Columbia, but they were international students because they have people coming from all over the world to that school. So we used to call this preschool our little model UN because, at one summer I had 5 languages in my classroom, and most of the kids that had those languages could not speak English, and I had cheat sheets everywhere telling me how to say, do you want another cracker? Do you need to use a bathroom? Your mommy will be here soon. All those things in all these different languages. But one family, they were from China. They wanted their son to be fully fluent in Chinese. That was very important to them. But they also wanted him to speak English. And this is what they did, and I just thought it was brilliant. Inside their apartment, it was Chinese. Everything. Chinese culture, Chinese language. And in fact, when I made a home visit, their little son laughed the whole time I was there because they spoke to me in English in their apartment. And they never did this. And so he was just like, it's like, oh my God, they're speaking English and it's in the house. And he just didn't even know what to do. And his mother is apologizing, going, oh God, what's the matter with him, But I got what was going on. The minute they walked out the apartment door, they switched to English. So inside the apartment, it was all Chinese. Outside the apartment in New York City, where a lot of people spoke English, they spoke English. I had him in my class at age 3.5. He was completely fluent in English. perfect accent, and his parents assured me he was completely fluent in Chinese. And it was effortless. So, that's what happened when a child is bilingual from birth. But the preschool years are the time when we can teach a second language without pain, because our brain is so plastic. In this same preschool, because we had so many people with different languages, I had a family who was from Thailand. And the little girl, who was 4, did not speak any English at all. And the father participated because he did speak English. The mother didn't speak any English at all. And so, but this little girl had watched some children's TV and she'd learned the ABC song, so they gave her the nickname of A. So A was in my classroom. Well, she loved the housekeeping corner. She loved the dolls, the dishes, all that kind of stuff. And so did another little girl named Mandy, who was an American child who only spoke English. And A only spoke Thai. Okay, so they would both head for this dramatic play center. And then they'd get frustrated because they couldn't talk to each other. But they would still play. Then one day, I heard a little commotion, and Mandy, who was the English-speaking child, was an assertive child. I say with quotes around it. And I look over, and she's got A by the hand, and she's dragging her throughout the housekeeping area, going, chair, table, doll, coffee pot, plate, cup. And it was like, would you speak English so we can play better? So, and A's just cup, house, doll. She's just copying it and loving it. So she got all these words, and so they were playing better. And one Monday morning, literally like only 3 or 4 weeks passed, this just blew my mind. Dad brings her in on Monday morning, and he's like, she got grammar this weekend. I don't know what happened. She's speaking in English using grammar. And from then on, she was fluent in English. It was simple. And there's no price to pay in curriculum, because as we all know, there's no set curriculum in preschool. We can teach them anything we want. I mean, whatever they're interested in. If it's bugs, we do bugs. If it's, cows, we do cows. I mean, whatever they're interested in, we can teach anything about anything. So we just go with the flow, whatever their interests are. So there was no price to pay of losing curriculum at the expense of learning English, which does happen if you enter elementary school and only have a little English or have no English and the instruction is in English. Then you are learning English at the expense of learning reading, writing, and arithmetic. You're learning English at the expense of your curriculum. And that's where we have the problem with not supporting, clear bilingual education for children. But what we could do, this is where I want to see these things happen. I want those children, if we can get them in, and programs like Head Start are very good at this, is get them into a preschool where there's no price to pay. But you can learn the dominant language that's going to be used in the school system so effortlessly and in such a friendly way. We sing songs, we point to numbers, we do the calendar, all these things. They just absorb all this information. They get the English, and it makes sense, because we're talking, preschool's concrete. We aren't talking philosophy with preschoolers. We're talking about, can you put the blocks away? And so that's easy to pick up. It's so we point to the block and say block, and it clicks. And once you get a kid started on a language, that's all it takes. And then they just go for it. So this is something I wish we could do, is bring any child, if we can get to them before they are going to go to school, get them into a good preschool. And that will help them learn English, and it will be painless and effortless, not like what it is for us as adults. Our plasticity goes away. And so when we learn another language as an adult, we go crying the whole way learning that. It's painful. You got to try hard. It's hard to get your brain to learn a second one.
So I want to thank you, Dr. Bobula, again.
Thank you. And thank all of you for coming.